met him at our last retreat, but we're glad to have you back here where you can reach so many more people far and wide to talk about this super important topic. So thanks again for being here, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some questions.
So much for that introduction, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here today and talk about a very, very important subject and something that is and has become very important to me over the many years that I've been a bird veterinarian. And, people often ask, why as a clinical veterinarian am I so focused on the welfare and the captive care more often on pet birds, but it really falls under the umbrella of all birds in captivity, whether they be in sanctuaries, rescues, zoos, any of those type of places. But again, more of a focus on pet birds is because I don't know that you can be a bird vet and not become extremely sensitive to avian welfare and extremely sensitive to the needs of birds, and most importantly, how we know and have to admit that the negative impacts of captivity and the very nature of keeping birds as pets does in many ways deny so many of their natural behaviors and so many of their normal activities that they would otherwise be doing in the wild. So a combination of just really over the years being aware of how many ways we negatively impact welfare of captive birds. One of the sort of brightest lights that we've had in quite some time is what I'm going to talk to you about today, and that is a review and understanding the newly adopted USDA standards for the protections that we now have for birds under the Animal Welfare Act. And it is something very new. It is something that many people are familiar with and may have a general idea of it. Most of us, when we have discussions, as Ann and I were just talking before this webinar began, it's a step in the right direction. And, at many times when things kind of feel a little bit helpless or hopeless, or, we're looking at not feeling like we're moving in the right direction, it is really nice when a breath of fresh air like this comes through and we can now say something like, birds are now protected under the Animal Welfare Act. And I think that's an important, huge step forward. Advance my screen. So again, going back through some of the general information, when we look at our fascination with parrots, it dates back thousands of years, back even to the time of Alexander the Great, back in the 4th century of our current era. People have always loved birds. We know that bird watching is an American pastime, and people have always liked birds, but they were generally rare in captivity and generally limited primarily to the wealthy and people who could afford to collect them, people who could afford to send somebody to South America and collect parrots and bring them back to Europe. It was largely based on that. And it was a sign of being wealthy if you had big, beautiful birds like this macaw that's in this picture. Okay, click on it. So what happened was the large-scale importation of parrots, basically from the late 60s, early 1970s until 1992, made parrots so much more common and available to almost anybody that wanted to buy one in the United States, as well as developed countries worldwide. And we do know that we deal with issues of poaching, trafficking, the illegal movement of birds. And we know which countries are on the top of those that have a high demand for pet birds. And the United States certainly is one of those. In 1992, we passed the Wild Bird Conservation Act, and that basically stopped the importation of wild birds into the United States. But that also is kind of the period of the birth of aviculture, and it brought in an era of captive breeding in the United States. So basically, since then, it's been left to breeders to try to meet the needs of the public who want to buy and keep pet birds. And so aviculture geared up to fill that demand and has been doing so ever since. So just some of the back history and some general information about this. The US Department of Agriculture, until this year, has failed to include birds under the Animal Welfare Act. The little bit more back history, and most people don't realize, is several animal rights or animal welfare organizations basically sued the USDA and said, you are way past doing this. You promised you'd do it. It was supposed to happen a long time ago. It has still not happened. It's time to make it happen. The USDA then responded and said, okay, it's time to move forward with it. It's going to be a big undertaking. It's going to take a lot of work and initiative and effort, but it is something we need to do. And that's something that we're all grateful for and glad, again, that we can be having this conversation today. It was a fairly complex process, but like I say in the slide here, we've made it somewhere. We have something to go on. Somebody recently, when I was talking about this issue, mentioned a quote that says, it may not be perfect, but if we can't have perfect, can we be happy with good enough? And I think that's a big part of what we're looking at here. So on February 21st, 2023, the Federal Register was published, and it provides the regulations to ensure the handling, care, treatment, and transportation of birds regulated under this act. And as we go through this lecture, we'll talk a little bit of who that covers and who it doesn't, and some of the exceptions. But again, for the most part, a couple of groups that took the initiative to sue the USDA got this in action, moving forward, and brought us to where we are today. So the problem that we're dealing with really is the Animal Welfare Act was signed into law in 1966, and it's the only federal law that regulates the treatment of animals in testing, exhibition, transport, sold as pets, sold by dealers. It is enforced by the USDA's Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, who enforces animal care. The document has been amended numerous times since its original passage back in the 1960s. But if you look to the other side of the screen, the other issue is how it's largely been described. And before February of this year, you can see it said the animals that are covered and the regulations, but it said the term excludes, and number one said birds. You can still see some of the others there that are excluded. They unfortunately are still excluded, and reptiles are still excluded from the Animal Welfare Act. And we know people keep a lot of pet reptiles in this country as well. So the goal was that the Animal Welfare Act that requires minimum standards of care and treatment, and kind of as a side note, I hate minimum standards. I hate that word. I hate saying that, but at least we know what minimum standards are. And it does provide the minimum care standards and minimum treatments that animals bred for commercial sale, used in research, teaching, testing, exhibited, anything that we as humans use animals for need to provide some protections. And I have talked to so many animal law enforcement officers over the years who basically feel like they fail prosecuting bird abuse, neglect, hoarding, anything that any of us could probably look at and readily accept is an abuse and a deplorable situation where there just weren't legal protections for these animals. There was nothing to go on. So you'll notice as well in this lecture, there are some websites as well. I'm also always happy to share the lecture as a PDF that can be distributed to anybody that thinks they would like a copy as well. So the basics of what happens and what we need to do moving forward is anybody that maintains a USDA license or registration already has until August of this year to become compliant with the new avian welfare regulations. Anybody who is not currently licensed or registered has until February of 2024. So there is still time to meet the requirements before the law begins being enforced next year in February. The target audience, who are we dealing with here? Well, we have to understand what avian species are considered to be pet birds. And then the target audience includes people's understanding of whether they need to have a license or a registration. Pet bird species are basically defined by the regulations as those that are commonly kept as pets in the US household. So the birds that you and I probably keep as our pets are the vast majority of what we're talking about here. The interesting thing is that when the USDA rolled out the regulation and they said, okay, we need to start working on getting birds covered, they opened up the phone lines for people to call and comment about this whole scenario. And it was a live recording where people could call in and express their concerns and thoughts. And there were over 19,000 comments made to the USDA to try to help them develop these guidelines. And I think that's pretty amazing because almost 20,000 people cared enough to call and voice their opinion about the regulations we need to protect birds. And I think that says a lot about people who care about birds and who keep them as pets, because we realized we needed to do this. I was one of those 19,000 commenters, basically urging the USDA to move forward with this, to partner with people who knew how to care for birds, and to be really cautious and careful about who we exclude. So currently we have a published document. Some people find it difficult to understand. It's fairly long, very detailed, but it does cover all aspects of captive bird care. And very importantly, they focused on emotional needs of birds. So they factored in the psychology, they factored in what we consider to be important for enrichment and the emotional needs of birds when they consider this. And I love that part. And I think that lends to a bit more credibility to what we're moving forward with. So to really just summarize the basics of this, there are 3 license classes. It's A, B, and C. And I have the general information here. It lists, the bird list define what avian species are considered. And then there are these 3 classes. Class A is for breeders. And they set very specific rules of what you would need to conform to if you need this license. Again, you can see Class B for brokers and dealers, and Class C is for exhibitors. And what people really need to do is if they're in a situation where they think they might need licensing, they have to follow the provisions to see if it applies to them so they could get that application in and get their licensing. For breeders, there's specific stipulations here. They seem a little bit unusual to most people when they say you're required if you hatch birds and you sell more than 200 small birds, or if you sell more than 8 large birds, then you need a license. Now, some people might say 200 certainly is a huge number. Where did that come from? I don't know. It came from the people in charge. It came from decisions of discussions. It came from influence. It came from those 19,000 comments. They came up with these numbers, and this is what they put into effect. For Class B, it's for people who purchase and resell birds that are not hatched on their property. Auctions, rescues, random source dealers, anybody who is selling a bird to somebody that did not breed that bird. And then Class C licenses are exhibitors. So if you exhibit more than 8 pet birds to the public, so carnivals, circuses, roadside zoos, petting zoos, aviaries, anything like that, then you need a Class C license. And so basically, these are the 3 classes of license that anybody doing any of these avian related activities would need to get. And the reason for licensing is to have registration and subject you to inspection and enforcement. And that one sentence is sort of the crux of everything we're looking at in this talk today. Having that license so that you are now available for inspection and somebody could make sure that you're doing the right thing. For the bird choices that are covered, body weights are those that are an average adult weight. So when they divided birds up, they decided to look at what's an average weight for adult birds to figure out who gets covered by small birds or large birds. And just a side note, birds that are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act are excluded from the definition of being a pet bird. So that is one of the exceptions. A few more we'll talk about in a couple slides. So the designation of the small bird species, these are just basically birds that weigh less than 250 grams as an adult weight. So they have birds listed here. They tried to focus on pet birds. The list does include columbiforms like our pigeons and doves, which are very popular pet birds. They did put poultry on here. I don't know how many chickens weigh less than 250 grams, but if you happen to have some mini teacup chicken that fits under that, they would fit under the small bird species. But again, most of us can agree this list is going to be the small birds that we think about as captive pets. And then the large bird species, the larger parrots. This list as well includes the most commonly kept parrots. We typically think of macaws, Amazon parrots, African greys, these type of species in the cockatoos, but they added a few others here as well. Hornbills, turacos, and kookaburras, less common pet birds, but certainly they are. Larger species of columbiforms, crows, corvids, and then any poultry. So basically they divided it up to keep it real simple. There's either small pet birds and large pet birds, and it's basically just based on their weight. And then the weight enables them to have numbers that they can enforce for licensure. I hope that makes sense, but that's how the USDA has designated to do it. And they had to make it so that it would be somewhat, I guess, in a sense, simple enough to understand and be able to truly be enforced. So what activities don't require a license or registration? Again, birds used for food, fiber, or improved animal nutrition. So these are birds that are produced that don't need licensing because, for lack of a better word, they're going to be dinner, they're produced for down, they are used for scientific studies to improve animal nutrition. They're largely not going to be considered pet birds. The exhibition of farm animals, those animals that are classified as farm animals, which is a clear distinction from pet birds or pet animals. Birds used in all falconry sport. And there was a lot of outspoken people about pushback against any of these regulations applying to falconry and the keeping of those birds. Pigeon races or pigeon fancier shows, which are very popular in some parts of the country. People who still exhibit pigeons, probably as pets, are going to be under different license requirements, but it's not required for pigeon races or pigeon fancier shows. And then, like myself and most people probably attending this, birds kept for individual use or entertainment. So if you keep a pet bird or 2 or 5, we are not subject to need licensure to keep those birds. It's largely more focused on how can we ensure we include breeders, sellers, and anybody who's promoting and pushing birds that are going to be sold, distributed, moved around, or potentially in places where there could be unethical or immoral or activities that lead to abuse or neglect of those birds. Anything that violates welfare needs to be protected. One other rule that sometimes confuses people is what the USDA is called the retail pet store rule. And basically what this says is face-to-face sales of pet birds where the seller, the buyer, and the bird are all physically present, meaning you go into PetSmart, you decide you want to buy a zebra finch, you are there to buy, they have the bird there, they're selling it to you. That exempts them from licensure. So it's basically what they've called the retail pet store rule. And that is one of the exemptions. There are many people who feel like we need to have better regulations for pet stores, that they should not have had as clear of an exemption as that, but that's the way it has been set up as of now. And then broker sales and non-pet bird species are not eligible for exemption. So again, we go back to what is called the retail pet store rule, and it just means face-to-face sales of a bird where the transaction occurs and somebody buys, purchases, and leaves with the animal. They're not required. Part of the issue is when we really do talk about the numerous issues that we think impact birds. When we think about avian welfare issues. And we think of the fact that more than ever, so many more people are in tune and care about parrot welfare. They care about birds in captivity. They care about trafficking. They care about the legal and the illegal importation and movement of birds, not to mention unethical breeders and all of those issues that we deal with. So umpteen numbers of welfare issues that face birds, and one of those is pet stores and the care of birds. And this is not any particular pet store, probably it's all of them, but we do know that birds, or any animal for that sake, sold through a pet store is sold as a commodity. It's a business item. It's sold to anybody that wants to buy it, generally without restriction or regulation. So retail pet stores rarely provide people with the information they need on bird care beyond either handing them a care sheet or providing some basic information and answering a few questions. Interestingly, some pet stores used to, and some probably still do, have that deal where the bird is free if you buy the cage and the cage setup. So they include a budgie or two when you spend enough money buying equipment and supplies to have the birds. But a lot of people who buy birds may not know a lot about them. They don't understand their history, their psychology, and their needs as a pet. This gets into another huge welfare issue that we talk a lot about, and that's the rehoming of birds. That's the desire for people to not want to keep them, so-called dumping of pets. We know that here in America, it's very easy. If you don't want a pet, there are many, many ways you can make sure that pet is removed from your home when you no longer want it. So it is fairly unfortunate that that's the situation, but people may not know what they're getting into, for lack of a better way to say it. They're just not aware of what that bird needs. People will impulse buy. They'll see a beautiful bird and they'll want it. They think it would be fun to have. They've seen them in the movies and on TV. So we do have an issue with this. And then generally people are not ever going to be informed about the fiscal needs, the emotional commitment. They're not reminded of lifespan, though we know captivity shortens it. We know that many of these birds live a long time. And we do know that sometimes people say, well, now that I'm retired and older and I have more time, I'd like to get a baby macaw, with a good chance that even though that bird may not live 100 years or 80 years, it may outlive them. So keep in mind that we do have an issue with that. And this may be one of the bigger issues with moving forward with the provisions of the Animal Welfare Act coverage. So registration requirements. I talked earlier about licensing and registration as the two categories. One is licensing and the other is registration requirements. So people who work with birds who are not subject to the licensing requirements we discussed, either any of those licenses labeled A, B, or C, may fall into the need for registration. One of those that requires registration are transporters. These are people who transport animals for hire, ship them, drive them, move them, pick them up at airports and relocate them, anything like that. They're going to need to have a registration that permits them to be able to do the transportation of pet birds. The immediate handler, the person receiving custody of animals in connection with the transport, is required to be registered. It needs to be known that there's somebody moving birds around. So that would require registration. Now, research is another category. A lot of birds are used in both biomedical research and other forms of research, be it scientific, be it nutritional, be it improved methods of agricultural production, birds that are kept in research situations. Many veterinary schools may keep parrots for research as we're trying to advance clinical veterinary medicine and try to come up with new treatments and medications. But birds that are bred for research are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. It's a whole separate division. There are protections in place for animals that are used in research, but they fall outside of the Animal Welfare Act. There are a number of enforcements, there are rules, regulations, and standards of animals used in research, but they're not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. Research, teaching, testing, experimental purposes, that type of thing, as well. If birds are caught in the wild and then used in research, there is an exception there, and they will be covered under the Animal Welfare Act. So that is one exception, but eggs are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act either. So birds bred for research, wild birds that are used in research are, and then eggs under any form are not going to be protected by the Animal Welfare Act. So what is excluded from registration? People using birds in field studies, birds used in agricultural research, any of the studies that are to limit wildlife damage and human interaction. So that's going to fall under the jurisdiction of other governing bodies, maybe things like Game and Fish or Fish and Wildlife Services, but those would be excluded from registration. Birds used in veterinary clinical trials with established vet-client-patient relationships. So if a veterinarian that sees and treats a lot of birds wants to do some sort of study, and they want to use birds to test something specifically that's within the realm of moral and ethical standards, maybe they're looking at a certain blood test result on those birds. Maybe they're looking at birds that eat a certain food and they want to check their cholesterol. I'm just making hypotheticals, but any birds that would be used in that, which would be probably our pet birds, are excluded from registration. And then any use of dead birds for anything. And on one hand, you have to figure the USDA is not going to be able to enforce anything. We obviously have to assume that if the bird is dead, it should change the ethical and the welfare aspects of what's going on with that animal. So these would be what are excluded. So again, either licensure is required for what we've discussed, or registration is required for what you see on this slide and that general information. So again, the purpose of licensure and registration is so that the USDA can now enforce the regulations outlined by the Animal Welfare Act. What that means is inspections should occur. And any individual or businesses that sell birds, ship them, use them in research that need to be licensed or registered, anybody doing anything with these birds, generally covered by the Animal Welfare Act, is subject to inspection and enforcement by the USDA. The inspectors can conduct unannounced visits to licensed or registered facilities, and they can review care and treatment covered under the law. Then what they would do is cite them for any violations, let them know anything they're doing wrong. Anything that doesn't meet the standards of care under the Animal Welfare Act would basically, they should be ticketed for. And they would then be required to correct or undo whatever it is they're doing wrong with that. USDA inspectors follow biosecurity procedures, and the USDA has outlined a very specific set of what inspectors can and cannot do and what they're allowed to do when they do a site visit. So say we have a large-scale macaw breeder, they have a lot of birds, an unannounced inspection comes, an inspector comes and they are licensed. They need to ensure that the person is licensed is actually following the regulations and the law. They will not physically hold birds, touch birds, need to handle them. It will be direct observation through cages or in enclosures. Again, they will practice strict biosecurity. They will not disrupt birds that are breeding or nesting. They will be very careful and very sensitive and try to do everything they can to uphold standards of care while doing these inspections. It's also vitally important to remember that every individual that has birds is also responsible to do their own inspections. Once you're licensed and you know that an inspector may show up at any moment, you should be doing your own sort of daily in-house animal inspections. Anybody should be assessing their bird's health, caring for any sick animals. But if you're doing your own evaluations and inspections, knowing that you may have a formal inspection, it may help improve outcomes, save time, save money. And then again, the reason we're all here is increase welfare for captive birds. One stipulation is that if your veterinarian, when you're licensed, approves the shipping and transport of unweaned birds, that is allowed. And the concept of selling and moving and placing unweaned birds is another in that long list of welfare issues that we've talked about when we look at issues that face birds. The selling of unweaned birds is believed to improve the human animal bond. It's believed that they'll make better pets. People want to get them out as soon as possible, and very often to somebody who has never raised a bird before. You now have a helpless little baby animal that is 100% reliant on someone who doesn't really know how to care for them. So that does remain a huge welfare issue. But according to the stipulations of this, a veterinarian can approve the shipping of unweaned birds as long as they have careful written instructions on the conditions of how they need to be transported, and it's within 10 days of shipment. So regulation standards would require that. But a breeder wants to sell an unweaned bird to somebody, they want to ship it from California to Florida to its new home. As long as an attending veterinarian signs off that it's okay, that is allowed. And again, that does challenge some of the welfare issues. As a side note, there's been a big push in the welfare world to move away from human reared birds. And there's a belief that parent and co-rearing is the best thing for these birds. And I know there are some places in the world where they actually don't allow hand rearing of birds. So co-rearing with a human and a bird, or letting parents raise them to a certain age, really does probably confer a better outcome because of the risks of confused imprinting. So just another welfare issue to tuck into the conversation. For people that need to move forward with this, some information here as well. The licensing and registration assistant is online. It's available to anybody. So if you go to the website, it basically will walk you through a series of questions. When you answer those, and it only takes about 5 or 6 minutes, it will then tell you what you need to do based on who you are. So it's going to ask you a series of questions that are basically the things that I've talked about in this webinar thus far. How many birds you sell, who you sell to. They just try to figure out who you are so they know if they need to recommend a license or a registration. And then you could move forward from there. There's also some contact information. Again, this information is available online. I would absolutely urge people that have direct questions that you'd like to get answered directly from the USDA to contact them directly. They are a government office. I mean, they are there for us to be able to reach out. They are now responsible for enforcing these regulations. So anybody that has questions, concerns, comments, anything that they need to, both email, calling them directly, or contacting them is very highly recommended and is a service they need to provide to us. At the bottom of this slide, there's a website there. Basically, that's the subchapter that outlines the provisions of the minimum requirements for captive birds. Again, if you're interested in reading more about this or you haven't looked yet, if you basically just start Googling USDA, Animal Welfare Act, birds, any of that, it'll bring you up to the main pages. A number of different links. And then the USDA also has a series of videos, which you click on and they'll take you to YouTube. And they explain a lot of what I've talked about today. And they're good short reviews. They're easier to follow. And that information is available to figure out what we're doing, who needs to be under license or registration, and how to make it work moving forward so that we continue to have the right kind of enforcement. So basically, to summarize what we've discussed, birds are now covered under the Animal Welfare Act. And with enforcement and adherence, the two key words, it's going to provide protection for captive birds that have not been in place before. It's going to allow a higher standard of captive care. It's going to allow a standard of legal enforcement, and it's going to raise the overall welfare for captive birds. Like I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, It's not perfect, and many people have bigger issues with it than others, but it's a huge positive step in the right direction. We oftentimes feel like most things in life are baby steps, but as long as it's forward, we have to take what we can get. But it is a huge positive step toward better welfare for captive birds long term, and also better standards for legal protections long term. So that's all I have to present today. I appreciate the attention. Keep in mind, we all have an ethical responsibility providing the best care we can for all birds living in captivity. This is only the first draft and the first set of regulations. It may be modified, amended, and changed over time as needed. In the short term, it's a general summary of the information people need to know, with the big take-home message is at least we have moved in the right direction when it comes to captive bird care. Thank you so much for your attention, and we can open up for some discussion and questions, and I can review a little bit in the chat as well, or we can answer just direct questions. I did let Ann know as well, if people have questions that they want me to answer that we don't cover in the discussion this morning, you can email those and we'll work towards getting those answered for you as time permits.
That's great. You mentioned that your slides were also available as a PDF. Maybe you could send those to me, and then if anybody wants a copy, just let us know, contact@phoenixlanding.org, and we'd be glad to share them. That would save you having to, do that for anyone. So
Absolutely.
thank you for taking such a complicated topic and making it more digestible for us. I know for me, I have a hard time understanding sometimes the difference between who has to register and who has to get a license. And as I understand it, our organization, since we have a small adoption center, has to get a registration, but we don't have to get a license. And so would that also apply to some of these smaller pet stores?
It depends. I mean, largely the pet stores are still almost always going to be exempt from the retail pet bird rule. That rule that said the buyer, the seller, and the bird are in the same place at the same time and changing hands. So
Right.
it largely will exempt them, even a smaller pet store. It's basically come in as a regulation to exempt them as of now. So that's the rule on that. Hopefully it doesn't change, because like I mentioned in here, we do know that many pet stores are guilty of substandard practices for the movement of birds. A store is a business. It's a commodity. It's selling a bird just like it's selling bird food. It's just like it's selling bedding for a rabbit. They're just moving them through. So it's a shame on that front, but that's what the law is right now. It's going to remove protections for people who try to fight against pet store issues.
So if since we've gotten the hard part done, and we've gotten this bulk of things covered for birds under the Animal Welfare Act, and now we want to take the next step and see maybe these pet stores get coverage, what can we as just the general public do to move that along? What would be your recommendation?
My recommendations are along the flow of the momentum that started with all of this. Like I mentioned in the beginning, when the USDA said, okay, we're ready to start figuring out how to get birds included, we need help and need to know what to do. But this needs to be an ongoing process. It can't just be, okay, we're done. It needs to be an ongoing practice. And we always need to adapt to possibility of change and updating regulations. I mean, the Animal Welfare Act in and of itself has been updated numerous times ever since its original passage, and we have to assume the same will happen for birds. So it's the same thing as anything else any of us choose to challenge in life. We have to speak out. We have to contact those people in direct control of making change. You can post on Facebook that you're upset about something, but that's not going to foster change. Contact the USDA, let them know how we feel. Make sure that we're contacting, the representatives and the people who can enact change, so that hopefully if they hear it enough times, they're willing to consider it. So we should absolutely, and even if anybody thinks there's a violation of the act, it's never wrong to report that. So it just has to go to the right people at the right place to hopefully get some modifications over time.
Yeah, because I think what they wrote in the standards of care are pretty good. You know, they're pretty good detail, and it wouldn't be a huge leap to now apply those standards to other places. So again, I think the hard part's been done just to outline that. And so I want to encourage everybody not to be, there was a lot of discouraged comments while you were talking, because we all have encountered those less than optimal bird stores. So I want to encourage everybody not to give up. Yeah, to keep pushing, just like you said. So how do you think this applies to like bird shows and bird fairs, since that could sometimes be a face-to-face transaction too? And they're kind of,
Yeah.
iffy.
And to echo your original statement, right, the foundation has been built, and that's what we're all accepting this really is. We're at a point where the basic foundation, step one, is in place. And
Right.
so, yeah, there's a lot of exceptions and a lot of sort of missed places that may eventually get changed. But in those particular places, it's a little bit challenging because there's already not a lot of regulation and enforcement in those situations.
Mhm.
And it largely really depends on whether any of those people are going to need to be registered or they're going to need to be licensed. If they are a breeder and they are selling that number of birds, then they really need to follow those provisions and standards. Again, it's always easy for things to glide under the radar. It's always easy for anything to slip by, but at least it's going to require knowing these regulations are in place, and then how do we get them enforced? So, to answer the question more directly, it's like the lawyer saying, at least I have something to use if I need to prosecute, when I can prosecute. If we don't have it, then nothing happens. So again, it's the individual's responsibility, it's the USDA's responsibility, and it's just ensuring that we figure out a way to make sure people who need to be licensed and registered do so we can enforce it.
Mm-hmm. And enforcement basically starts next February. Is that my understanding? Yeah.
Correct. Everything has to be done by like February 21st of 2024.
Mm-hmm. So people could walk into places like bird fairs and ask the breeder, oh, do you have your Animal Welfare Act registration? I mean, start making that a point of discussion even. I know we've been advocating for the last 20 years for this to be included. So now I feel like state and local agencies also have something to hang their hat on, that they didn't before. They would always say, I'm sorry, I can't do anything about that terrible situation, right?
Right. And that's a big part of it too, is there are state and local regulations, and they have been seriously lacking when it comes to coverage for birds. If I'm not mistaken, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but as best I know, California is the only state that allows that blocks the sale of unweaned birds, like
Right.
California. So when you talk about state and local regulations, this is a federal regulation. This is something that applies to everyone. So states may have separate exclusions. State laws, if you actually start looking through that, it's mind numbing, but you'll see like maybe one state covers only certain birds. Maybe some covers only their terminology. They might use the word caged birds, and then someone's like, well, my birds don't live in a cage. So there's all these weird exceptions and rules. But again, to reiterate, this is the foundation of something. And yeah, you mentioned 20 years. I think that's about the number that people have cited is when this should have all happened. Like
Right.
we should have been having this webinar 20 years ago saying, hurrah, these regulations are now here, but we're here today,
Yeah. I remember
which is
Dr. Jolene Briscoe was at USDA, and she was our guest about 20 years ago. And she's like, it's in the bottom drawer. We just need somebody to pull it out, and we'd be like, okay, we'll write that letter again. Yeah.
right. And here we are 20 years later, and it
Yeah,
happened.
finally.
Yeah, finally. And so it's a step in the right direction. And it's funny too, because most people that know me, a glass half full is still half empty.
Right.
I find it very difficult a lot of times to really find the positive in a lot of these things. And especially when you start really looking at a lot of these issues, and you, as well as many other people here, know so well the issues facing captive pet birds. And so when we start looking at it, it's like we're at a point now finally where we're grasping and we're glad to have something to hold on to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know when we first started, like a lot of good, well-meaning people, we thought, oh, sanctuary is the way to go. And at this point in my life, I would never send a bird to a sanctuary because I don't know any that have sustainability, frankly, and they tend to get in over their heads. Do you think that these regs apply to sanctuaries?
Depending on if they
Properly?
meet, yeah, and they probably will, yeah. Yeah, depending on what their policies are, depending on what they do, they should apply. I mean, some rescues, some adoption centers, some of the larger sanctuaries. I mean, we are very, very lucky to have the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, that organization GFAS,
Mhm.
which really focuses on their system of getting people registered if
Standards.
they truly
Mhm.
have a sanctuary. And I
Right.
think they do a great job. This only augments that, but it's probably going to lend over into sanctuaries as well. And like your comments, many sanctuaries, like the lecture I just gave at the AVMA conference, a lot of these sanctuaries are full and they're at
Yep.
capacity. They're overwhelmed. They're underfunded. They just can't take any more. I mean, we live in a country with a first world country with a third world problem. There are more pets than people, be it
Right.
dogs and cats and birds. And the bird issue has gotten even worse because of the boomer generation and the older people who are going to be leaving behind a lot of birds in the next 10 years that
That's
have
right.
nowhere to go. So that's
Yeah.
a whole nother topic, but just the same. Yeah,
Yeah.
the
We do have that.
sanctuaries are
Mhm.
feeling it hard right now.
And they're often run by what I call mom and pops who, age, don't have a lot of money and have way too many birds. And we're asked to help them all the time. And there's just no way that many birds and the conditions just go downhill. It scares me that, like you say, there's a bird boom of birds coming our way in the captive world that we're having a hard time keeping up with. And we're almost at 3,500 birds, which is enormous,
Yeah.
by rehoming
And
standards.
and numbers are projected and potentially reaching millions, over 10 or 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So based on the current statistics of the number of birds currently owned, the potential for people to keep those, that unwritten number that people often throw around, that people keep a bird, sometimes an average of 2.5, 3 years, especially the large parrots that they weren't, they
Right.
weren't prepared for. That's a short amount of time to keep something that could live 50 years.
Yeah.
So.
I'm sad to say that we consider 5 years as an adopting home kind of an average, and, you take it and move on to the next home. But
Isn't it
yeah,
sad
it's
to
not
say
a very
that?
long
Yeah.
time. Yeah. So, and it's not the bird's fault, and the bird is not usually the problem. It's just needs a new home. So everybody out there, change your language and promote adoption in a positive way. So there'll be less newer birds coming into the system. That's like you said, the 80-year-old goes out and buys the young macaw. Well, and then they want somebody else to take it forever, right?
Right, right. And I see, some of the comments here in the chat, and people are singling in and to umbrella some of those, humane societies, local organizations, state representatives. Again, those are all great and important things, and they are now also subject to this as well. So this at least is sort of the umbrella that everything else falls under. Humane
Yeah.
societies now have to follow these regulations. I mean, organizations, zoos, anybody, they all are going to fall underneath it. So, quickly scrolling through a lot of the comments about that, and a lot of people are keying into, right, contact your local SPCA, contact your animal law enforcement officers, give them something to go on. Interestingly on that, because I see it's a common thing in the chat, I was just in Denver, Colorado, giving a lecture about the issues of sanctuaries and rehoming of birds. And an animal law enforcement officer stood up at the end and said, as of today, we have no written regulations for birds. He goes, I know what to do for dogs and cats. I'm pretty good if it's a farm animal, but we have nothing for birds. He goes, where can I find those? And I said, I hate to answer this by telling you they don't exist, So this is also fuel for that whole thing as well.
Yeah.
So
As
yeah,
you know, we wrote
everybody,
that shelter document 20 years ago for the state of Virginia because they had that question. What do we tell our shelters? Yeah.
right.
What's a bird? Yeah. And how do you distinguish between a parakeet and a macaw? That's a huge difference when it comes to
Very
care.
different.
Yeah.
Especially when it's a shelter that's never taken in birds and doesn't have cages and bird food,
Yeah.
and a big screaming, Moluccan cockatoo will scare most people. So
And the dogs. Yeah.
yeah, and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
like Chris Shank says here, it's really important that we advocate for not selling unweaned babies. I wish more states would pass laws like that because it sure does make a difference.
It does.
Yeah.
And maybe this will be the fuel for that. Maybe this will give them the opportunity to do it. I mean, we've known for a long time too. I mean, in America, especially the political America of the last 15 years, has not been a place for animal law to matter.
Right.
It's the lowest thing that we care about. And you can understand there's a lot of bigger issues. We're getting more and more divisive in this country, and we're getting into a realm where the smaller things are going to be completely forgotten. And having a president or somebody high in office that had to focus on animal law, it just doesn't happen,
Right.
So, and I don't foresee that happening.
Right.
I continue to have fears of where we're going to be in the next 4, 8, 10 years in this country. And animal law just doesn't take precedence over so many other things.
Agreed. That's why I'm so glad that we finally have these regulations to hang our hat on.
Right.
And hopefully nobody in the future will, I mean, the unfortunate thing is they're regulations, not laws. So it's easy for the next administration to wipe them off the books if they want to. And we don't want that to happen either. So
Right.
what is your interpretation of what transporters, like if we have volunteers moving birds up and down the East Coast, does that require an organization like ours to have a license, or is that just commercial transporters?
Right. It's largely focused on commercial transport, but I don't want to misinform that. And so what I usually, a lot of people that contact me, I tell them go through the license and go through the registration, tutorial online and answer it and get your answer directly there, or call for verification. If it's just that sort of movement of a pet bird, that type of thing directly, it's probably not registration. It's going to be largely more commercial transport movement companies that do that. I don't know if that'll change over time, but if there's anything anybody is sort of iffy about, do the tutorial, contact them and verify it. My understanding is right now that probably doesn't need a registration. If it's something that's happening a lot and you're at the airport every day picking up birds and it does become almost a commercial thing, then it might err on the side of just registering if that's something you do a lot. I guess there's probably no negative aspect to the registration. So many people who think the negative aspect of the licensure is inspectors are going to show up at my property randomly. Well, hello, we need that, but there may not be as many negative aspects to registration. It might even be more of it just covers for the worry of it.
Right. I agree.
Yeah. Good.
And the thing you mentioned that we've done online is pretty easy to go through to answer questions to see what you're required to do or not. Yeah.
It is. And there's videos there and there's tutorials. And I guess I would say as well, and then I'll probably have to sign off in a minute, people who feel defeated, many of us who are at a place where we want more, we would like more happening. We wish we were in a better place. We wish we didn't have these discussions, that there were no sanctuaries. Some of us that would like to see a difference in pet ownership overall, maybe. And I don't want to open that can of worms, but we can talk for days about it. But people who feel defeated, people who feel like this isn't enough, people who feel like we're just not where we need to be, I agree. But this is the first point where at least I'm saying, it is the right direction, like we keep saying. So it still feels like not enough to a lot of people. It still is divisive to a number of people, but we really have to think about what people do, what you do, and even on a different scale, is who do we help? You know, that old welfare expression, you know, it may
Can't
not
help
change
them all.
it may not change the entire world, but it changes that animal's world. And so
Exactly.
sometimes that's really what we're looking at here. And if we save any more birds because of this that weren't going to, it's something.
Exactly. And
So
next year, maybe we can all tell the USDA that we appreciate as much enforcement as possible, you know,
Right.
and pose it as a positive thing, you know, great for you, go do more of it.
Yep.
So,
And many of us have reached out. I've contacted the veterinarian in charge of this program to introduce myself and to say, if it ever comes up, contact me. If there's anything I can do, let me know. If there's any way in the world I can help you with any aspect of this, there are people like me out there. Reach out to us. I know they have their people, but reach out to us. We'll help.
who is the veterinarian at USDA now?
Cody Yeager.
Odie Yeager.
Yeah, his
Okay.
name is Cody Yeager. His information is, I think if you can reach him directly, I think the phone number is
Yeah.
published there or the email, but he's the main person in charge.
And
And
I
so,
put the link a couple times in the chat. I encourage everybody to go and it's only 10 pages front and back, to download it, read it. You know, I think you'll be impressed with the level of detail about water, food, housing, etc. All the important things are addressed in pretty good detail. So
yeah, and that's
uh,
part of it. Yep.
yep. For anybody who's IAABC, your code word today is standards. Just email us, contact@phoenixlanding.org, and I'll give you the code for getting your CEUs. And don't forget, Debbie Foster will be back with us on August 12th. We hope to see you again then to talk behavior. And we love you, Dr. Pilny, and all you do for birds. You
Thank
know,
you.
we do. Thank you.
Same back at you and everybody else. We're all trying to make a difference, and we're moving the right way for the first time in a long time
A long
legally. So,
time.
yeah.
There's a
So
little bit of hope out there. That's right.
let's keep it at that. Let's keep looking at the hope. And thank you for the opportunity to
Oh,
speak.
yes.
And again, I'll make sure that I email you a PDF in the next day or so people can have that. And if anything you need of me, please reach out.
Thanks. I'll see you at Exotics Con too.
You will. Take care,
Okay.
everyone. Thanks for your
Thanks
attendance.
again. Really
Bye-bye.
appreciate you. Bye.